think it's very interesting how Jesus does not simply have one approach to wisdom. On some occasions, he will go deeply into his own sacred text. He will recover those words from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, and release to the captives, and say, in your presence, this scripture is being fulfilled. So he was deeply rooted in elements of his own sacred scriptures. And then in the passage we're going to learn today, it was like he's looking at his tradition and going, yeah, I know that's what we used to think, but now we need to think like this. And I think the beauty of that kind of paradigm is that we're invited to do the same thing. I know we used to think like this, but now we're invited to think like this. What is always curious to me, when I was asked on the radio yet again this week if St. Andrew's was still a church, on the radio, I thought to myself, is it because we think differently? But is that not faithful to our own tradition? Anyway. So, some words from Matthew 5. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? In his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Award-winning something, brought a core idea from academic psychology into mainstream cultural dialogue. The notion that human behavior at any given moment is an interplay between two forms or systems of thinking. The so-called System 1 thinking is fast, intuitive, and completely unreflected. Things we do automatically or have learned so that we do them as it feels without thinking. For example, walking, talking, reacting emotionally, knowing the answer of 2 + 2 is 4, driving a car, and so on. System 2 is the brain's slower, more deliberative and analytical mode. It doesn't do 2 + 2, but it picks up 17 times 24. It gets involved in difficult life decisions, in self-control, and sometimes in checking and correcting what we might call intuition. The main thing about System 1, Kahneman says, is that it can't be turned off. The main thing about System 2, even though we might imagine it to be the real conscious us, is that it's lazy. It's very capable of endorsing and rationalizing what our fast thinking is telling us to do and say. So I was listening to this man being interviewed about a week ago and have been thinking about these two ways of thinking in relation to our spiritual tradition and in relation to life. It's clear that both kinds of thinking are absolutely necessary. We need to be able to respond quickly in many circumstances. And yet there are circumstances in which we need to be able to step back and be deliberate. And it's not that one way of thinking is better than the other. The wisdom is in recognizing what kind of thinking is required at the time. It seems to me that acquiring the wisdom of Jesus requires, first, a deliberation on a common practice. The very tribal practice, and he's speaking to this in this particular passage, of excluding people who were not in your tribe, especially if their behavior did not serve your well-being. And he's referring specifically, in the first part of that passage, to the experience of living in an occupied country. So Judea was occupied by the Romans. And some of you have probably visited countries that have been occupied. When I was in El Salvador in the summer of 1989, it was occupied by its own government. But that just meant that there was a soldier at every corner who was not necessarily your friend and who was trained to consider you a potential criminal. Not a great basis for any relationship. And so he's speaking to a community who would have had a very knee-jerk reaction to the Roman soldier who would have been stationed at every corner. And that would have been completely rational, wouldn't it? And so it would take some deliberation on your part to see that soldier in the same light that you would see a friend. And that's what he's asking right now. And it seems to me that the purpose of any spiritual practice, whether it's prayer or meditation or walking or whatever it is that takes you to that place of deliberation, is to retrain our brains so that we're able to deliberate on those knee-jerk reactions that we have towards certain people, because we are wired to see some people as our tribe and others not our tribe. And it's easy, I think, to see the larger pictures. It's easy to look at classic racism, for example, and go, oh, well, those Americans, the way they're still treating African Americans, it's so clear that they haven't done enough deliberation. But we know that in the South, in particular, and once again, I may be exaggerating, that was how you were wired from the moment that your wiring was created, right? So, and we all know then that we have certain templates as well. We are wired, and it's the constant challenge of maturity and the invitation to wisdom that asks us to look at our own wiring. So the goal would be to arrive at the place where all of the fears within us, some of which we are not even aware of, would make room for a wholeheartedness towards every person without thinking. Think Dalai Lama, for example. Wholehearted. Doesn't understand the word enemy, meditates 5 hours every morning. I guess what is a bit disconcerting, according to Kahneman, is that System 1 can't be turned off, and System 2 is lazy. That's kind of fun, isn't it? We know that, right? We know that while we can step away from a situation and deliberate, we have the ability to do that, but we don't always have the discipline to do that. And so very often, our more deliberative, reflective self just endorses what our knee-jerk reaction self is doing. So I now have 4 things that I invite you to think about, or choose one. and they aren't necessarily related. Luke, my son, 18, going to be 19 next week, is doing the foundations year at King's College. It's a place that is crawling with 18 and 19-year-olds who love to think, love to debate, love to look at every side of the argument. That's what that foundations year is about. It's about getting them to look at it all and think it through. But the story he referred to the most when he came home at Christmas was a couple of experiences of now discovering the tyranny of the liberal perspective that was insisting on political correctness at all times. So if you hadn't quite thought it through, and if you hadn't quite chosen your words carefully, and if you hadn't quite been as absolutely inclusive of every perspective as possible, then you were criticized. So, for example, my initial knee-jerk reaction to all things Republican, or, that's an easy one, right? That we get to step away from that. Or you fill in the blank, right? Your initial knee-jerk reaction to right, that you have to look at is not helpful, whatever it is. Because how can we create a climate of discussion and empathy when we find ourselves entrenched in one position or another? So it doesn't matter from the right, from the left. The question is there space created in the middle for the differences and a togetherness at the same time? So, that's one thought. Here's another thought. I want to say something about the role of suffering in slow or fast thinking. The role of suffering can easily open a door into both kinds of thinking. So, for example, we suffer at the hand of another, and our first instinct is to respond with anger and revenge. This might be one knee-jerk reaction. Or there might be another knee-jerk reaction, and that is we suddenly suffer from a disease or suffer from the loss of a loved one, and just like that, we experience a profound empathy for all of those who have walked that road before us. And we don't even think it through. It's just like that. Our eyes are opened. Wow, I didn't realize that I just didn't get. I just didn't get what they were going through. So suffering can facilitate knee-jerk reactions, or suffering might be the catalyst to thinking more profoundly. So it might slow down time altogether. And I think that, the experience of the last week was certainly insight to some of that. So it slows down time so that we are able to think more profoundly about life and love and loss. So suffering might in fact be a catalyst to deliberating about our lives to the point where we encounter gifts that we might never have known. Which is very interesting, right? Because we, by and large, live in a culture, this 20th, 21st culture, that almost abhors suffering, like it shouldn't even happen. When in fact, it may be, though you wouldn't wish it, and it's not meant to be a teacher or the way it's supposed to be or God made it happen. But in fact, it may be a window to a richness and an insight and a wisdom that might save our lives on all kinds of other levels. So this next thing I'm going to say, I'm not sure it has anything to do with today or not, or even these passages or slow or fast thinking, but I think it's important. So as those of us who have lost a friend this week, who have lost someone from our circle, I'll share a conversation that I had with Gary about 3 weeks ago, where it was clear that Linda was declining quickly. And we talked about time. And I was reminded of someone in the last 3 months who said, the illusion is that we think we have time. We think we have it. And when I walked into the hospital room last Saturday night, just 8 days ago, Gary said, all I can think of, Lynne, are those words. You think you have time. So I think, having said that, that's not necessarily meant to be a scare tactic, unless it needs to be. You know, sometimes we need to be scared into thinking about that, because we need to be scared into some more deliberate thinking. But in a culture where fast seems to be better, maybe not at our age. Maybe that's the best thing about growing older, is that maybe we recognize the illusion of fast, and we get to kind of live into the value of slow. But I think that the other thing that deliberate thinking does is it does something with time. So that I can tell you that last Monday, which was Linda's second last day among us, and it seemed like it was like one day left, and it was just so horrendous. One day. That's so fast. Yet, that day went like this. And it became a slow day, and it became a day full of kind words and encouraging words and connectedness. And somehow in those moments, time just goes like this. So I think we get to choose what we do with time. And I think that I can think of a time when I was working full-time and raising 2 children full-time and running a house full-time, and so much happened in that time and nothing happened in that time. So it's interesting at any time of our lives to think about time. And what is the gift of that time for us? And finally, one more thing about slow and fast thinking, in regards, I think, very much to the passage that Jesus is, that we're thinking about. Yesterday, there were 30 of us who gathered in this room to hear again and participate in the unfolding of the settling of this country. And what was interesting to me was having 2 teachers, after we were debriefing, and a few adults saying, I never learned this, and I never taught it. And because we weren't taught it, we saw a whole population like this. And now that we know a bit more about our history, we are now in a time as a country of deliberation. It is time for deliberating. And that is important time. And there may be other areas in your life where that time for deliberating is important.